Let me first of all start by wishing the audience, all the CEP teams and colleagues, all the best for 2021, hoping that it will bring better news than 2020 did. I'm especially honored to be part of this discussion today, and I'd like to thank first and foremost, the Counter Extremism Project for hosting this highly interesting and timely discussion. I've read the report, most of it, not all of it. Unfortunately, I didn't have time, but I read most of the report with the utmost interest. And also, it's always complicated to compare situations in various countries, as we all come from a different historical, social, and political background. Especially when it comes to movements like the violent far rights, which often present themselves as closely linked to what they perceive as our national identities. But despite those difficulties, I really found that those reports really struck the right tone, and I learned a lot there. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to put it to good use in my daily job. To come back to what you say during my presentation, my office within the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Europe is very important there, is in charge of coping with threats to our national security emanating from non-state actors. And of course, in this process, terrorism is at the very top of our agenda. We are, of course, not in charge of operational activities against terrorist groups or individuals, which is obviously the task of our security and intelligence services. But our role at the MFA is to spearhead international initiatives to counter those threats that have a transnational dimension. Hence, the great interest I put in your report. It won't surprise you, but I will start by obviously saying that Islamist terrorism is, of course, our main focus as far as France is concerned. Just to give you a bit of figures, Islamist terrorism, caused 287 casualties in France since 2010. We had to suffer 6 attacks in 2020, causing 7 casualties and injuring 11 people. That being said, the priority we give to Islamist terrorism doesn't mean that we don't take seriously what we call politically motivated terrorism, especially far-right terrorism. And I would even say that we are taking it increasingly seriously, bearing in mind the recent attacks that we witnessed in Christchurch back in 2019, New Zealand, in El Paso in the US, but also in Halle and Hanau in Germany. So, to kickstart our discussion today, I thought it might be useful for me to give you a few takeaways outlining the situation as we at the MFA perceive it in France. The first one is that we haven't seen a real surge in numbers when it comes to ultra-right activists over the past 2 decades. The figure has remained quite stable, roughly 3,000 people, among which we consider that 1,000 are prone to violence. And most of the groups and the individuals are well known and extremely closely followed by our domestic intelligence services. Second takeaway, the threat is real, although it should not be overestimated. 5 terrorist attacks from far-right organizations or individuals were thwarted since 2017, most of which were directed against our presidents or members of our governments with, we can say, various degrees of preparation. And we also had a very significant attack which took place in Saint-Just on December 23rd last year, when a man killed 3 gendarmes with a rifle. Third takeaway, while neo-Nazist groups are clearly the most violent in France, they only represent a limited amount of people. We witness, on top of that, the emergence of new trends around what we tend to call neo-patriots or survivalists. Those people rely mostly on emotional reactions to news events and more deeply on the feeling that France is declining, that the state is too weak, that they fear the great replacement with what you mentioned, Hans, with the immigration, and more broadly, groups and people which have a hard time coping with globalization. It's important to note that those people come from very different backgrounds, and I think Professor Camus might be talking about it, and he's way more a specialist than I am, so I won't be talking too much about that. But what I find interesting is that you could tend to think that usually those type of extremists are mostly to be found in disfavored part of the population, but it's not always the case. And it's not the case anymore in those new trends, because if you look at recent events, you're going to see people which are, I would say, fairly well integrated with quite an important educational background. Fifth takeaway, most of the violent acts I was talking about, you had the five attacks that were swatted, but also roughly 40 violent acts which were caused by people linked to ultra-right movements in 2020. Most of these acts were caused by lone wolves or people who, while being associated with more or less formal networks, decided to act on their own. It's important to have that in mind because it makes their actions extremely difficult to anticipate and, of course, also to counter. Last but not least of my takeaway, at this stage, we have found only a limited number of international connections, which makes all the work conducted by the CEP all the more interesting to us. Based on these takeaways, I would have a few recommendations to make, which I will humbly submit to my colleagues here and to the audience. First of all, I think it's important to raise awareness. Especially in France, where although Islamist terrorism is and will remain the most prominent threat for the foreseeable future, we need to remain vigilant to violent political activities from both ends of the spectrum. I've mentioned especially the far-right extremism, and I mean, this is what we're going to talk about today, but it's also important to bear in mind the fact that we've been seeing in France an increasing number of violent acts caused by people affiliated with the left extremism side of the end of the spectrum. And of course, I think that the impact of the COVID, both in terms of economy, but also the social economic distress, will keep fueling the rhetoric from both these groups. Second recommendation, I think it's also important to avoid losing too much energy on the concepts. We've had on the international stage a lot of discussions with our international partners, trying to frame this threat posed by far-right extremists. And it's quite difficult to actually find a consensual term or notion, because as I said in my introduction, all the countries come from a very different historical, political, and social background. And as, for instance, the United States has been referring to what we call RANT, racially and ethnically motivated terrorism, this is not something that we see in the same terms in France. So it's important to, I think, to avoid losing too much strength and energy debating on the notions or the concepts, but to focus really to identify the profiles which are the most likely to act, and to understand which are and what are the deciding factors that lead those people to take action at some point. Third recommendation, I would say that it's important to build upon the effective tools that we've put in place to counter Islamist terrorism, especially when it comes to preventing online radicalization, moderation of digital platforms, potentially also identify financial flows when it's possible. Because although Islamist terrorism and politically motivated terrorism are extremely different from one another and sometimes come in reaction to one another, we can see that they sometimes rely on the same emotional strings, or at least sometimes on the same tools. So it's important that to be aware that those tools that we've put in place with more or less success to combat and to counter Islamist terrorism are to offer, I would say, an efficient answer to politically motivated terrorism. And I think especially about the crisis call to action that we've launched with New Zealand, but also what we've been doing within the EU, especially during the very successful German presidency. And I think Simon will talk about it a bit later in terms of adopting an ambitious regulation on terrorist content online, the proposal of the European Commission on the Digital Service Act. All these proposals and all these legal pieces are, I think, part of the answer to that kind of politically motivated terrorism. What did I have in mind? And I think, yeah, I had one last recommendation. I think last but not least, we'll have to really pay attention to growing links between different conspiracy strands. And I think the QAnon movement in the US, which managed to gain foothold in France over the past year, is something that is concerning to us. You might have seen it, I don't know, but we've seen it clearly, a French flag that was displayed by the people who broke into the Capitol earlier this month in Washington, DC. And we're in the process of assessing the weight and the reality of these movements in France, because it's clear to us that we shouldn't think that any other society can be immune to that kind of threat. So basically, these were my 2 cents. I hope it was a good way to kickstart the discussion, and I'm really looking forward to the exchange with the audience.